let me just try to summarize. I mean, most of your points actually fall largely within this idea of, for teacher A, there are two perspectives that we want to look at it from. So, one perspective is that the teacher's perspective itself, okay, wherein what we want to say is that the teachers can adapt the lecture dynamically to the student's response. So that what we are saying as immediate clarification, all of those things are possible. And then from the student's perspective again, the advantage seems to be that the student can ask questions to the teacher, the student can see the teacher in the classroom. All of those seem to be the advantages of the teacher A model. However, the key drawback here is that the student does not have access to the teacher while working on the problems at home. Okay. So here there is an important point to keep in mind, that is, we become experts only when we do things, right? We do not become experts by hearing things. So in order to develop expertise or mastery in a subject, it is necessary for the students to practice, and it is necessary for the students to actually do something with the material that the teacher is saying. So and that activity happens at home, and at this point the student does not have access to the teacher. So also the teacher does not know what difficulties the students face while doing the problem solving. Okay, on the other hand, now let us look at teacher B. So from the teacher B's perspective, you are having the video at home and exercises are being done in class. Now what happens is, from the teacher's perspective, the teacher can address students' problem solving difficulties in the class itself. Okay. So it is not difficulties with respect to understanding of the topic, it is not at the recall or the understand level, but it is at the apply and the higher levels. Difficulties that arise at that level can be addressed by teacher B in the class. Okay. The advantage for the students again is that the students can watch the lecture video at their own pace. So if they want to repeat, if they did not understand something, they can go back and get that. And the second thing is, when they are in class, they can get immediate help from peers and the teacher during the problem solving process. So this is the advantage from the student's perspective. Also there are some points which are common in both the cases. For example, there is a point which one of the centers is saying that there is eye-to-eye contact between the student and the teacher, that is important, and what you can see is that it is possible in both the modes. It is possible for teacher A also to have this eye-to-eye contact, as well as for teacher B to have the eye-to-eye contact. So essentially what is happening is that the total amount of time of the study is remaining the same, and the difference is in what students do in class versus what students do at home. So let us try to reflect about what happens in a typical traditional classroom. So in such a classroom, what happens during class is mostly information transmission. Information transmission means the instructor is giving a lecture and students are taking notes. Sometimes the instructor may ask questions to which students respond. Sometimes the students ask questions to which the instructor responds. Okay, and what is happening outside the classroom is the activity of assimilation, or the students getting some mastery over the content. Okay. And this is done by the instructor giving problem sets and assignments which students have to solve and submit. And now students may work individually or work in groups. Okay, so I will pause here for a minute for you to reflect upon what are the limitations, what might be the limitations of such a classroom. Okay, so having given you 1 minute to reflect, so let us look at some limitations. There are some centers which are still sending in the limitations. It is very encouraging that many of the limitations that you are sending in are actually matching with the limitations that I have listed on this slide. So let us just quickly look at these limitations. Okay. So during class, when there is the information transmission that happens, the instructor is lecturing. So often as instructors, we think that we are the ones who are most excited about our content, right? I mean, even right now I am speaking and I am excited about saying this, I do not know how many of you are actually listening to me, right. So, that is one reason that students do not pay utmost attention to the instructor's lecture, okay, however good it may be. And students, the second thing is students assume that they can understand because they can follow the lecture. So, this is a big drawback with the lecturing model, and even if we improve on lecturing by having some interactivity such as instructor asking questions, often what happens is that these questions are answered only by a few students, typically who are the high achievers or the toppers of the class, and others are left behind. On the other hand, when students ask questions, often these questions are also asked only by a few students, and sometimes the instructor makes the assumption that because a few students have understood and have asked some advanced questions, the entire class is able to follow at that level, and so the instructor sometimes unwittingly goes ahead with the material when a large part of the class has not been able to keep up, has not been able to apply the learning that has been transmitted in that particular session. So, that is one limitation of the traditional classroom from the during class perspective. If you look at the limitation of the traditional classroom from the outside the class perspective during the assimilation phase. So, now the instructor feels that okay, I have given problem sets and I have given assignments to the students, and if they do these problems and assignments, then they will attain mastery over the content. So, now what may happen is that these problem sets and assignments may be too challenging for some students, on the other hand they may be too simple or boring for other students. In both cases students may lose interest in solving these problems, and the instructor often does not come to know which student is having what type of difficulty. So, instructor does not know which are the students who have found it challenging, instructor does not know which are the students who have found it boring. Okay. So, it can possibly lead to copying of the answers. Okay. So, the second reason is that students study individually or in groups, and this typically happens just before the assignment submission deadline or the exam, which may cause students to focus on the assessment and not on the concept mastery itself. So, again most of us are familiar, most of us often say that students study only at the last minute. So, considering that perspective, what is likely to happen in a traditional classroom is that even though the instructor has given lot of problem sets and assignments for the students to practice, all of this practice often for a majority of the students gets postponed to a few days before the exam, right. That is a very common phenomenon that we observe in our classes. So, there will be those students who do it very diligently early, and there will be some students who will never do it, both extremes are there, but for the large part the students will do it only when there is some forcing function such as a submission deadline or an exam. So, the drawback of doing that is that the students focus at that point because of the deadline is on the assessment and it is not on the concept attainment. So, these are the two major limitations of the traditional classroom. What is this flipping the classroom? Okay, flipping the classroom is simply about going from information transmission in the class and assimilation outside the class, which is the traditional model, to saying that let us move this information transmission to outside the class and let us move this assimilation to inside the class. So, the reason for doing this, moving the information transmission to outside the class, is that with the help of technology it is easy to capture this information transmission, and we can let students work on the lower cognitive levels such as what is the definition of something, explain how something else works, explain the process of some other system. All those level of concepts can be worked on by looking at the information transmission, and the higher order concepts or higher order cognitive levels, they can be dealt with in class, which is where the students have the difficulty. So, the key idea of a flipped classroom is, so this is the flip that is happening. Information transmission instead of happening in class, that is moved to outside class, and assimilation instead of happening outside class, is moved to the in class. So, this is the main crux of the flipped classroom idea. So, what is flipped classroom? Just to recap, flipped classroom is one way to ensure that class time is spent in assimilation rather than information transmission. So, the instructor typically finds or creates videos on the topic, and students watch these videos before coming to the class, and then the class time is spent in activities and discussion. So, this is the important part of the flipped classroom model, where the class time is spent in activities and discussions. See, often even when we say that, look, I want my students to understand this topic deeply, what essentially we mean as instructors is that we want the student to acquire some level of mastery beyond recall and comprehend levels. So, what we would also as teachers be happy with is to help students assimilate the information and to get them to attain that level of mastery. So, that is what the class time in a flipped classroom is spent on, rather than simply in information transmission. So, that is the key difference between the traditional model and the flipped classroom model. Okay, so let us ask the question, the next obvious question that we would have in our minds is that, okay, it is all fine, does it really work? So, the key idea here again is that there are many studies that establish the benefits of active learning strategies. Now, what is a flipped classroom? Flipped classroom is nothing but a student doing some activity outside of class, student doing some preparatory activity such as watching a video or reading some material, and doing a lot of active learning on that material in the class. So, as a result of which, the flipped classrooms that incorporate active learning automatically get the benefits of these active learning strategies. Okay. So, there are many papers on these strategies. One of them is as far back as 2001, the idea of flipped classroom with peer instruction showed that students who worked in that model had significant learning gains compared to traditional instruction. And then there were other research work, controlled group studies, which showed that flipping the classroom with small group discussions can also produce significant learning gains. So, there are gains not only in terms of student learning, that students learn better and they are able to perform better in the exams, but also there are gains in terms of students are more interested in the topic, students come to class, and all those other advantages are also been documented. Okay. So, to summarize what we have seen so far, why is flipped classroom a good idea? Because the class time is spent in assimilation rather than information transmission. Secondly, because the class time is spent in the higher cognitive levels of apply, analyze and create on that topic rather than lower levels of recall and understand. And third, the support of peers and the instructor is available to the student while they are working on these higher cognitive levels. So, if there is a doubt or if there is some clarification or if there is some quick conception that needs to be corrected, all of that can happen while the student is working on these problems or on these activities which are targeting the higher cognitive level. Okay, so before we go much farther into what exactly is a flipped classroom, let us just get an idea of what these videos look like. So, what sort of videos do instructors create? Typically videos are 10 to 20 minute lectures on one concept. Okay. So, videos may include slides, they may include audio, they may include some annotation, they may include writing on a tablet or screen capture of an application. Okay, there are many such videos that can be seen on the web. So, here are some sites, and what I will do now is just to quickly show you a glimpse of one of these videos. Okay, so this is a video from Khan Academy and it is on Pythagoras theorem. So, we have bypassed this question of is it in my discipline or is it in your discipline by simply taking a topic which is from high school level.
90-degree angle before, the way to think about it is if this side goes straight left to right, this side goes straight up and down. These sides are perpendicular, or the angle between them is 90 degrees, or it is a right angle. And the Pythagorean theorem tells us that if we're dealing with a right triangle, let me write that down. If we're dealing with a right triangle, not a wrong triangle, if we're dealing with a right triangle, which is a triangle that has a right angle or a 90-degree angle in it, then the relationship between their sides is this. So if this side is A, this side is B, and this side is C, and remember, the C that we're dealing with right here is the side opposite the 90-degree angle. It's important to keep track of which side is which. The Pythagorean theorem tells us that if and only if this is a right triangle, then A squared plus B squared is going to be equal to C squared. And we can use this information. If we know two of these, we can then use this theorem, this formula, to solve for the third. And I'll give you one more piece of...
Okay, so that was a glimpse of what happens in one of these videos. I mean, I am sure you all have seen such videos on the net, and the key idea about a flipped classroom video is such a video is created very specifically for a short duration. So about 10 to 20 minutes, or maybe sometimes even a 5-minute video, or rarely beyond 20-minute videos. Okay, so that is a flipped classroom video, and in that one concept is explained. The basic idea, like what we just now saw, was the basic idea of the Pythagoras theorem of a square plus b square is equal to c square, where a and b are on the two sides. Okay, so that is what happens in the video. And then what happens in the classroom itself is again an interesting point. Now the content that the students have watched is given some context. So often in the classroom the instructor will pick up some real world scenario. So for example, if you were the instructor, you might pick up an actual a building whose height you want to estimate, or some such mechanism, some such real world scenario wherein you want to apply the Pythagoras theorem in order to solve a problem. Okay. So as a result of which, students are now actively engaged in problem solving and critical thinking beyond the traditional course. Okay. So the students are not coming to your classroom to hear you say that a square plus b square is equal to c square. On the other hand, students are coming to the classroom to work out problems which deepens their understanding of the Pythagoras theorem. So what do we mean by deepens the understanding is that they are able to apply it in various scenarios, they are able to analyze a problem and see whether it is a problem for Pythagoras theorem and so on. So the other advantages of flipped classroom activities are that students are now encouraged to ask exploratory questions and delve beyond the core curriculum, and they can be transformed from passive listeners to active learners. So this is the big advantage. And why is this a big advantage? Because we already know, we have seen in the previous sessions that active learning has great deal of benefit. So just to recall, what is active learning? In active learning, the instructor creates carefully designed activities that require students to talk, write, reflect and express their thinking, and students go beyond listening, copying of notes and execution of prescribed procedures. So students actually take ownership of their learning, and we know that the benefits of active learning are that students are actively engaged with the content and learn from each other. It builds a friendly yet academic atmosphere in the classroom, and most importantly, it includes all the students in the teaching learning process and not just those students who are highly self-motivated or who are high achievers in that particular classroom. So the key idea of flipped classrooms and active learning is that a classroom with instructor and peers present is more useful for students to apply their learning rather than listening to information transmission and asking clarifications. So, the point here that is being made is that it is not that information transmission is not important. Information transmission is also important, but the time that the student spends with the instructor and the peers is better spent in students learning to apply the knowledge that they have gained in the information transmission rather than simply listening to the information transmission. Okay. So, the important thing is, in a flipped classroom, the in-class time can be devoted to tasks that promote active learning, since this information transmission part of the class happens before the students come to the class. So, this is an example from two courses that I have taught. So, in a course on computer programming, where the topic was arrays, the pre-class activity that the students had to do was to watch a video that defines an array. What is an array? So, the video basically says that an array is nothing but a collection of elements, and this is the way to define an array in C++, and then it shows C++ examples on using arrays. So, simple examples of how arrays can be declared in a program and how they can be used in a program. So, that is the pre-class activity which does this video, very similar in idea to the Khan Academy video that we saw. And then the in-class activity were of two types. Okay. One type was to give a worksheet which has problems or programs using arrays. Now, for some of these programs, the program was given and the students had to predict the output. Okay. So, in some cases, so there are three typical ways in which computer programming can be encouraged. So, one is by asking students to predict the output of some program. In another case is to asking students to debug a given program, and in the third case is by asking them to write programs. So, what we did was to have students predict the output of some of these programs, then debug other programs, and also insert missing code into the programs. So, what this worksheet actually did for the student was that instead of simply knowing the topic of arrays in theory and having seen some examples of arrays, they now actually worked with programs in the class, and wherever they got stuck, they could simply raise their hand, and either a TA or the instructor or one of their peers would be available in order to clarify the point at which they were stuck. So, that was actually a good session for the students, because they were actually working with the content and not simply listening to the content. The second in-class activity that we did was getting them to write think, pair, share activity to write a program to sort the array. So, for example, in the think phase, all that the students had to do was to come up with some pseudocode idea of how will I sort 10 numbers. Suppose 10 numbers are given, what is the mechanism that I will use in order to sort those 10 numbers. So, those 10 numbers are the array. Then in the pair phase, the students can go on to work with a partner to write the C++ code for sorting their numbers, and in the share phase, they can go on to looking at comparing their program with the instructor's program to sort the array. So, that was the think, pair, share activity for this flipped classroom. Here is another example. This is an example from another course called communication networks, and the topic was IP addressing. Okay, so, the topic of IP addressing once again is a topic which I used to find had a lot of information transmission in it. So, the pre-class activity here was that they simply watched a video that described the basic mechanism for assigning IP addresses in a network. Okay. So, the pre-class activity was simply watching the video, and all that the video contained was that there are different classes of IP address, there is a class A, there is a class B, and there is a class C, and so on. Okay. Now, subsequently when they came to class, they did not need to be described what these various types of IP addresses are, and so they could simply directly go on to peer instruction questions on the IP address classes. So, you could give an IP address and ask them to identify whether it is a class A or a class B or a class C, or you could ask them to write how does a class A address look. So, questions of that sort could be dealt with in the classroom, The second such activity that they could do was a debate on the pros and cons of hierarchical addressing. So, the way the internet addresses are set up, is that a good way, is there a better way to do the addressing of computers, was another debate that they could do. And the third activity that they did in the classroom was to design solutions to reduce the inefficient use of address space. So, sometimes the IP address space gets wasted because of one organization being allotted more IP addresses than it actually requires, and so the students themselves had to think of ways in which these inefficient use of this address space can be reduced, and then all that I had to do as the instructor was to point out that each of these solutions that the students came up with were nothing but the names of some of the efficiency increasing mechanisms that were already there in the internet, okay, and the details of those mechanisms then made the content for the next flipped classroom. So, here again we will take a pause to alert ourselves about one point. Okay. So, often a flipped classroom is mistaken for the video aspect only. So, that is why it is important for us to keep in mind that a flipped classroom is not an instructor simply creating lecture videos and making them available. It is not an instructor simply finding lecture videos and asking students to watch them. It is not a student simply watching these lecture videos or attempting to learn the subject on their own, and it is not the instructor simply giving clarifications to these videos or the content of these videos in the classroom. So, what is important is all of this is required, but it is incomplete without the latter part, which is that the instructor needs to create structured learning activities to be carried out in the class for the students to apply what they learned from the videos. So, this last part of applying what they learned from the videos is crucial aspect of the flipped classroom model. So, the key elements of a flipped classroom are, there are 4 ideas here. So, the first idea is to give students an opportunity to gain first exposure to the topic before coming to the class. So, this can be by the means of a video, or in some cases in some subjects you could simply assign reading material saying that okay, read this section from that book and before you come to the class, or read a paper. You know, if you are taking an advanced class, you could have students to read a paper before they come to the class. The second item is that we provide incentives for students to prepare for the class. So, this is again an important thing, because often we may have a doubt saying what do I do if students do not watch the video before they come to the class. So, some sort of incentive is required for students to prepare for this class. We will look at what these incentives could be in a minute. The third thing is to facilitate higher level cognitive activities in the classroom. Okay, some examples of this we saw in the previous 2 examples, like you could have a think, pair, share, you could have a debate, you could have a peer instruction. Okay, peer instruction is nothing but what we have been doing as the poll in AView. And finally, what you want is you want to provide mechanisms for students to get feedback from peers and the instructor on the work that they are doing. So, this feedback goes by the term of formative assessment, where the student immediately comes to know what they are doing right, what they are not doing right, and it also helps the instructor to get a feel of how much the various groups of students are able to deal with the material in their class. Okay, so, those are the key elements of a flipped classroom. So, many of you may have heard the term flipped classroom, and it's been popular for the past few years, and you might have even read in newspapers and articles about it. So, before we get into defining what this flipped classroom is, let us do one small activity. So, here is a scenario. Consider 2 teachers A and B who are teaching the same topic, and both these teachers have different styles of teaching. So, teacher A gives a lecture on the topic in the class, followed by problem solving exercises and assignments which the students have to do at home. Teacher B on the other hand, asks students to watch a video of the lecture at home before coming to the class. So, teacher B might create the video, or teacher B might post a link to a video on the topic from some other repository, but asks the students that you have to watch this video before you come to class, and then does the problem solving activities in the class itself.